Before we begin, I want to offer a clear and firm warning. What you're about to hear contains graphic descriptions of violence, coercion, and abuse as detailed in open court during the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs. These are not dramatizations, but actual testimony given under oath, stories that may be deeply unsettling or triggering to some, especially to survivors of trauma or abuse. This content is intended for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is strongly advised. And remember, all individuals mentioned in this video, including Mr. Combs, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you're joining us for the first time, full summaries for days 1 through 5 are available on the video tab of this channel. What follows is day number 7. Now let's begin. Sean Diddy Combs sits at the defense table in a charcoal suit, jaw clenched and eyes hidden behind designer glasses as another day of testimony unfolds. It is day 7 of his racketeering and sex trafficking trial, and the atmosphere is heavy with expectation and dread. Each witness peels back another layer of secrecy from Combs's glamorous yet sinister world. David James, Combs's former personal assistant, returned to the witness stand in the morning. He's a solidly built man in his 30s, wearing a crisp dress shirt that can't entirely hide the fatigue etched into his face. James speaks calmly, but his words reveal a life pushed to extremes by Combs's demands. He recounts working 6 or 7 days a week, sometimes 20 hours a day, all to serve the mercurial music mogul. In his very job interview, he recalls, a Bad Boy Entertainment executive warned him, "This is Mr. Combs's kingdom. We're all here to serve in it." The jury shifts in their seats as James describes what servitude entailed, procuring Combs's preferred items and indulgences at any hour of day or night. James paints a picture of decadence on tour, hotel suites stocked with 40 different skincare products, a fresh Jordan sweatsuit, and even cups of applesauce to accompany Combs's late-night cheeseburgers. But alongside the harmless quirks were far darker provisions. The former assistant testifies that he often delivered personal items like condoms, baby oil, and bottles of Astroglide lubricant to Combs's hotel rooms. These items, James says, were for orchestrated sexual encounters known in Combs's circle as freak-offs. When he bought such supplies, he wasn't allowed to expense them through the company. Instead, Combs's security team would discreetly reimburse him in cash from a Louis Vuitton duffel that Combs kept, an ominous detail that hints at deliberate secrecy. James's testimony grows more unsettling as he describes Combs's drug use and the entourage's role in facilitating it. He recalls seeing bags of prescription pills and illicit drugs accompany Combs wherever he went. In one startling anecdote, James testifies he saw Combs nonchalantly swallow an ecstasy pill shaped like President Barack Obama's face, washing it down with champagne before a long night. The bizarre image draws raised eyebrows across the courtroom, a jarring reminder of how Combs's public life as a celebrity intersected with a hidden life of excess. Jurors scribble in their notepads as James confirms that yes, he often procured these drugs for Combs and his friends. By daylight, he would pick up opiate painkillers to fuel Combs through business meetings. By nightfall, he sourced party drugs to keep the music mogul's marathon parties going. The assistant's every task, it seems, was in service of Combs's appetite for pleasure and control. It's when James recounts a midnight incident from 2009 that the courtroom truly leans in. His voice steady, James describes a night seared into his memory. The night Combs set out to confront his rival. The lights in the courtroom seem to dim as James transports everyone back to a late Los Angeles night. Combs had been scrolling a hip-hop blog at home when a post about night sent him into a rage. Cassie Ventura, Combs' young girlfriend at the time, sensed the danger and begged him through tears not to leave, but Combs was beyond reasoning. He grabbed James and a bodyguard, and together they piled into Combs's Lincoln Navigator. According to James, Combs slid into the back seat, 3 handguns on his lap. James's throat visibly tightens as he narrates the drive. He remembers his own white-knuckle hands on the wheel at 4 a.m., circling the block of the all-night diner under neon lights, adrenaline thudding in his ears. In the back seat, Combs seethed with violent intent, flanked by his armed guard. I had a weird sense of calm, James says softly. Maybe because I was in shock, I kept thinking there are 3 guns and 3 people in this car. They never found Knight that night, while the Escalade they searched for wasn't in the lot, and James eventually drove his boss back home. But the terror of those moments still flickers in his eyes as he speaks. On the stand, James's account certainly feels like a scene from a crime drama. The powerful music executive transformed into a vigilante gangster, weapons in hand, loyalty and fear forcing those around him into silence. The mood in court is somber when James finishes the story. Even the judge, U.S. District Judge Arun Subramanian, lets a brief pause linger before motioning for the defense to begin cross-examination. In that pause, one can almost feel the collective thought hanging in the air. If true, this is a window into a hidden life where ego and violence blur dangerously. Defense attorney Mark Agnifilo rises for cross-examination, determined to chip away at James's damning narrative. Agnifilo is seasoned and unflappable, but there's an undercurrent of aggression in his approach now. He paces in front of the witness stand, probing for weaknesses. With pointed questions, he suggests that the incident might be exaggerated or even fabricated. That was a radical departure from the norm, wasn't it? Agnifilo presses, implying this was a one-off anomaly in an otherwise ordinary job. James agrees it was certainly unlike any other night in his tenure, but he adds with a note of defiance that he hadn't exactly felt free to protest at the time. Respectfully, sir, when someone has 3 guns in close proximity, I didn't think I had the option to say no, he says, holding Agnifilo's gaze. The defense lawyer pauses, lips pursed, perhaps realizing James is not easily rattled. Agnifilo switches tactics. In a sudden pivot, he asks James if he ever acted violently during his employment. You never choked Chef Jourdan, did you? The lawyer asks, voice dripping with insinuation. The reference to Chef Jourdan catches the jury's attention, and James's too. Jourdan Atkinson, Combs's personal chef, is known to be another upcoming witness. James frowns and firmly answers that he did not choke the chef. The prosecutor immediately objects to this line of questioning, seeing it as a ploy to smear their witness. The judge calls both sides to the bench in a brief, tense sidebar. After hushed deliberation, the judge permits Agnifilo to continue but warns him to tread carefully. Allowed to proceed, Agnifilo's insinuation hangs in the air. Maybe James was the violent one in an altercation, not Combs. The defense clearly aims to muddy the waters, suggesting James might have his own axe to grind or skeletons in his closet, but James remains unflustered. On redirect, the prosecutor gently asks him to clarify what actually happened with the chef. James explains that in that 2018 incident at Combs's Alpine, New Jersey estate, it was Combs who lost his temper at the personal chef, Jourdan Atkinson. Without delving into unnecessary detail, James testifies that Combs got physical with Atkinson and afterward ordered James to file a false police report framing the chef as the aggressor. A murmur ripples through the courtroom at this revelation. James admits he was torn. He didn't want to lie to police, but he feared defying his boss. So he did something quietly rebellious. He got in his car and drove around aimlessly for an hour, never actually going to the police. When he returned, he told Combs that the bogus report had been filed. It was a small act of resistance in a job where disobedience could mean instant firing or worse. James's recounting of this incident bolsters the prosecution's portrayal of Combs as a man who not only commits violence but orchestrates elaborate cover-ups to escape accountability. Before stepping down, David James endures one more bizarre detour courtesy of the defense. Agnifilo brings up an encounter James had years ago with Roger Bonds, one of Combs' security guards, and 2 female sex workers. The details are only hinted at in court, but the implication is salacious. Agnifilo's tone suggests he's fishing for any impropriety to tarnish James's credibility or distract from Combs' conduct. James stiffens at the question, and the prosecutor immediately objects again, arguing irrelevance. Judge Subramanian sustains the objection, effectively shielding James from having to answer. The cross-examination ends on a strange note, and James is excused at last. He exhales deeply, having weathered the defense's gauntlet of innuendo. As he leaves the stand, the jury has much to digest. James's testimony was a tour through the hidden quarters of Combs's life, from the extravagant applesauce on burgers and diamond-encrusted family mottos to the horrific guns, threats, and lies to police. More importantly, his account buttresses the prosecution's broader strategy, painting Combs not as an out-of-control celebrity acting alone, but as the mastermind of an organized ring of enablers who helped him commit and conceal years of abuse. The tension between direct testimony and cross-examination was palpable throughout James's appearance. Yet, despite the defense's efforts to cast doubt, much of James's story remains unshaken. As one legal observer in the gallery whispers, if even half of what he says is true, it's devastating. Late in the morning, a new witness takes the stand, Regina Ventura, mother of Cassandra Cassie Ventura. Regina enters the courtroom with a tentative dignity, a petite woman in her early 60s with deep concern etched on her face. She clutches her hands together as she is sworn in, and one can see she's fighting to remain composed. This is not just any witness, she's the mother of Combs's most prominent accuser. Cassie's explosive testimony last week painted her as a longtime victim of Combs's abuse. Now her mother offers a window into the agony of a parent watching and fearing from the sidelines. Regina speaks in a soft voice that compels everyone to lean in and listen closely. She recalls Christmas 2011 with a mix of sorrow and resolve. That was when Cassie, then in her mid-20s, came home to Connecticut for the holidays carrying more than just luggage. She bore bruises and a terrible secret. Regina testifies that her daughter emailed her during the trip north, a hesitant confession that Combs had been physically abusing her. On Christmas Day, in the privacy of their family home, Regina saw the evidence with her own eyes. Dark bruises on Cassie's backside, thighs, and the back of her shoulder. As Regina speaks, those same photographs, taken with a trembling hand in 2011, are displayed on a courtroom screen. The images of Cassie's injuries elicit gasps from a few people in the gallery. The jurors watch silently, some with tightened jaws, others with eyes flicking toward Combs and back to the screen. Combs himself sits rigidly, staring at the table, his expression inscrutable. Regina's voice wavers as she recounts, asking her daughter how this happened. Cassie told her the beating occurred after Combs discovered she had begun seeing another man, a fellow musician, the rapper Cassie briefly dated. Combs, Regina explains, took it as a personal betrayal and flew into a jealous rage. In that meeting, he assaulted Cassie brutally. I was scared for my daughter's safety, Regina testifies, her eyes glistening with tears she refuses to shed. In the audience, a few people hold their breath. The raw maternal fear in her voice is heart-rending. She testifies that soon after that violent incident, Combs contacted her directly. He was furious and demanded $20,000 from Cassie's family, ostensibly to reimburse money he had spent on Cassie during their relationship. Regina perceived it for what it was, a shakedown, or perhaps a twisted punishment. Combs implied that if he wasn't paid, there could be dire consequences. Regina says she felt cornered. In December 2011, terrified of what Combs might do next, she went so far as to take out a home equity loan on her house to raise the money. She wired $20,000 to a bank account at Combs' direction, essentially paying off the man who had beaten her child. The courtroom is dead silent except for Regina's quavering words. Even the judge leans forward slightly, hands folded, as if drawn in by the human drama playing out. Regina then recounts how, strangely, a few days later the money was returned to her account. Combs sent the $20,000 back after about 4 or 5 days. Why he did this is left to speculation, a change of heart, a show of power, or some legal advice whispering in his ear. Regina can only relay what happened. The effect it had on her was whiplash. She was relieved to have the money back, but it didn't erase the dread that had compelled her to part with it. Her testimony continues with an even more unsettling revelation. Sometime after the bruises and the payoff demand, Regina received an email that made her physically sick. In a quiet, tremulous tone, she describes reading a message detailing a threat from Combs. He was going to release sexually explicit videos of Cassie to the public. These were private recordings of Cassie's most vulnerable moments, tapes that Cassie later revealed were used by Combs to blackmail her into silence and compliance. The email also suggested Combs might have someone harm Cassie if she disobeyed him. Regina says that as a mother, imagining those tapes and the harm that could come to her daughter was almost too much to bear. "I thought I might lose her," she whispers, tears now openly slipping down her cheeks. Regina's brief appearance is like a shard of glass, small, sharp, and cutting straight to the heart. In just a few minutes on the stand, she confirms key parts of Cassie's story and shows the jury the far-reaching impact of Combs' alleged abuse. Her physical description of bruises and her testimony about the hush money and threats cast Combs not just as a volatile lover, but as someone who tried to exert control over Cassie's entire life, even reaching into her family. When the prosecution gently concludes Regina Ventura's direct examination, Combs' lead attorney, Mark Agnifilo, stands as if to cross-examine. Observers tense, expecting a fierce attempt to undercut the sympathetic mother, but instead, Agnifilo gives a thin smile and says, "No questions, Your Honor." In that moment, the defense effectively concedes that badgering this mother would gain them nothing and likely backfire. Regina is excused and she steps down gingerly, having delivered her piece of the truth. As she walks past the defense table, she does not look at Combs. He, in turn, keeps his gaze fixed forward, face impassive. Yet the absence of Combs' family in the courtroom is notable. The visual of Cassie's mother standing alone, unchallenged against the might of the music mogul is a potent image that lingers as court adjourns for a short lunch break. In the gallery and hallways, people murmur about Regina's testimony, a quiet knife to the defense's heart delivered without theatrics, only painful honesty. After the midday recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifts slightly. There's a sense that the deepest emotional pain has been laid bare by Regina Ventura. Now the trial pivots back to reconstructing Combs' alleged crimes in lurid detail. The prosecution calls Sharay Hayes to the stand, and a ripple of curiosity passes through the spectators. Hayes is an imposing 51-year-old man who carries himself with the confidence of a performer. Bald and muscular, he's dressed surprisingly formally, a tailored black suit and tie, as he is sworn in. Yet, as he introduces himself, a faint lisp softens his deep voice. He explains he's a male exotic dancer from Harlem, known by his stage name The Punisher. A few eyebrows shoot up at that moniker. Hayes flashes a disarming grin and even volunteers the origin of the nickname. "It was given to me as a teen, inspired by how I played on the basketball court," he says, prompting a few chuckles in an otherwise somber room. It's an odd moment of levity, the surreal collision of courtroom formality with the stage name of a stripper. But any humor evaporates as the questioning begins and Hayes delves into the world of Combs' freak-offs. Cassie Ventura herself testified about these drug-fueled sex parties last week, revealing how Combs had coerced her to participate in them for years. Now, Shereé Hayes provides a first-hand account from the other side of those encounters as one of the paid participants. Speaking in a steady cadence, Hayes recalls the first time he was hired in 2012. "Honestly, I thought it was just a regular private gig," he says. "An intermediary booked him for what sounded like a lucrative night's work, performing for a wealthy client in New York City." Hayes had been in the adult entertainment business since the mid-90s, so he wasn't easily fazed, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited behind closed doors. Hayes describes arriving at an upscale hotel suite. He later learned it was Manhattan's Essex House, and noticing something odd. The room was dimly lit with electric candles, and white sheets covered the furniture as if a sensual ritual or a crime scene was being prepped. Cassie Ventura was there, as was another man who Hayes initially did not recognize as Sean Combs. Hayes, expecting to do a simple strip tease, quickly realized this was something very different. "We started off seated on the couch," he recounts. "Under Combs' direction, the three of them began to create a look," a phrase Hayes uses delicately, which in practice meant rubbing baby oil on each other's bodies, making their skin glisten in the low light. What followed, Hayes testifies, was a carefully choreographed sexual encounter. He speaks matter-of-factly, explaining that oral sex and various pairings would ensue after the initial oiling and foreplay. Throughout it all, Hayes says, Combs orchestrated the scene like a director. The music mogul would sit back and watch intently, but he was far from passive. He'd give instructions, Hayes says. Combs would tell Cassie how to position her body, where to angle the soft lights for the best view. Sometimes he'd bark orders if something wasn't to his liking. Hayes notes that Combs himself mostly observed and occasionally joined in minimally, but the focus was largely on Cassie performing with Hayes for Combs' gratification. The jurors maintained stoic expressions, but a few exchanged uncomfortable glances during the more graphic parts of Hayes' testimony. It's salacious and disturbing, the stuff of tabloid scandal, yet here it is, under the cold fluorescence of a federal courtroom. Hayes mentions that upon arriving for each session, he was handed an envelope of cash, usually around $800 up front. Then at the end, Combs would sometimes ask if he wanted to finish, meaning to reach his own climax. Hayes usually declined, preferring to remain in a professional mindset and, as he puts it, keep things business. His answer hints at an almost transactional detachment. He was there to do a job and get paid, not to seek pleasure. Under direct examination, the prosecutor, Meredith Foster, a sharp-eyed assistant U.S. attorney, asked Hayes if he ever saw signs that Cassie was uncomfortable or unwilling. Hayes pauses, brow furrowing in thought. She sometimes sighed or seemed shy, he says slowly. He remembers that Cassie would occasionally emit a sigh as Combs directed her what to do, as if resigned, but Hayes is quick to add that at times it appeared she enjoyed it. There's a slight murmur in the courtroom at that comment. It's an unexpected statement. After all, Cassie testified that these freak-offs became a nightmare she was coerced into. Hayes' perception of her enjoyment could conflict with her narrative of coercion. Sensing the significance, the prosecutor drills down. Did he think Cassie wanted to be there? Hayes, perhaps realizing the weight of his words, hedges a bit. Look, I wouldn't have gone through with it if I thought she was truly uncomfortable, he says earnestly. There were no obvious cues of distress that I picked up on. This line of testimony is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it supports the defense's contention that these encounters were consensual, or at least appeared consensual to a participant. On the other hand, it underscores how well-controlled these sessions were. Cassie might not have dared to show discomfort in front of Combs, especially if, as she stated, she eventually participated under threat. The truth may lie in the nuance. Cassie learned to perform enjoyment because refusing was not an option. Defense attorney Xavier Donaldson seizes on Hayes' ambiguity during cross-examination. A tall, bespectacled lawyer with a calm demeanor, Donaldson asks in a friendly tone, "It seemed like there was consent there as far as you were concerned, correct?" Hayes nods and affirms, "Yes, as far as I was concerned." Donaldson leans into that phrasing, reinforcing to the jury that even the government's own witness, the male escort, didn't view Cassie as a victim in those moments. But prosecutor Meredith Foster isn't about to let that stand without context. On redirect, her questions become more pointed, almost turning Hayes into a witness against himself. She brings up an offhand comment Hayes made during his earlier, more freewheeling cross-examination, something about Cassie enjoying herself. "Mr. Hayes, you testified that Ms. Ventura enjoyed these sessions at times," Foster says, her tone skeptical. Hayes shifts in the witness chair, sensing a trap. "Well, I'm not inside her head," he clarifies. "I can only speak to what it looked like. I mean, she wasn't screaming or crying. If she was uncomfortable, she hid it." This admission actually underscores the prosecution's point. Cassie could have been masking her true feelings out of fear. Hayes also mentions a revealing anecdote about how he discovered the true identities of his clients. After the first session, he says he didn't recognize Combs or Cassie. They had given no names, but the second time he was hired while waiting in a lavish hotel suite, he flipped on the television. The hotel's welcome channel displayed the name of the VIP guest booking the room, Sean Combs. And perhaps there on the screen or in some news segment, he saw Cassie's face. Hayes realized with a start that he had been consorting with one of the biggest names in music and his protege girlfriend. It was a surreal moment, he recounts, to reconcile the public personas of Diddy and Cassie with the secret he now knew about their private life. For the jury, this anecdote drives home how clandestine these freak-offs were. Even the hired help wasn't told whom he was servicing until he figured it out himself. As Hayes wraps up his testimony, one can sense the divided narrative solidifying. To the prosecution, Sharay Hayes corroborates Cassie's account of being pimped out by Combs. He provides gritty detail of the freak-off rituals and confirms they happened repeatedly. He estimates 8 to 10 sessions between 2012 and 2016, all in New York. To the defense, Hayes offers a foothold to claim that Cassie was a willing participant who even showed enjoyment. Both sides will no doubt spin his testimony to their advantage in closing arguments. But in the moment, what lingers is the disturbing mental image Hayes has left. A dimly lit room smelling of baby oil, Cassie's silhouette moving compliantly under her boyfriend's commanding gaze, and a stranger named the Punisher being paid to act out a twisted fantasy. Is the kind of detail that makes the courtroom feel cold despite the heavy air. By mid-afternoon, as Sharay Hayes steps down, the prosecution shifts gears from testimony to tangible evidence. The next person to take the stand is Gerard Gannon, a special agent with Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. Gannon is in his 40s with a clean-cut look and an unflappable demeanor honed by years of law enforcement work. Dressed in a conservative suit, he could be mistaken for a businessman were it not for the palpable authority he carries. Gannon was one of the lead agents in charge of executing the federal raid on Combs's Miami home on Star Island in March 2024. Now he's here to walk the jury through what that raid uncovered, and the prosecution hopes this physical evidence will drive home the reality of Combs' secret life. The atmosphere in court shifts once more, now to a procedural, methodical tone. Assistant U.S. Attorney Christy Slavic guides Agent Gannon through his testimony. Star Island, even the name conjures luxury and exclusivity. Slavic has Gannon describe the setting. A celebrity enclave in Miami Beach where mansions sprawl behind high gates, each property worth tens of millions. Combs' mansion is among them, a 20,000 square foot estate that was as much a fortress as a home. Gannon recalls planning the raid, knowing the target was a high-profile figure with vast resources. We anticipated the possibility of armed security, he says flatly, explaining why they brought overwhelming force. The agent describes how nearly 90 federal agents were involved, an unusually large number necessitated by the property's size and complexity. They even employed an armored vehicle to breach the front gate, ramming it to gain quick access. Photos from the operation show a heavy tactical truck forcing its way past ornate iron gates as a swarm of agents in tactical gear pour into the manicured grounds. This isn't a scene from a movie. It's what it took, Gannon implies, to penetrate the bubble of wealth and security that Combs had built around himself. Once inside, agents swept through the mansion's lavish rooms, clearing it of any occupants. It turned out Combs and his family were not home. They had timed the raid for a day. The family was leaving on a trip to minimize confrontation. But what they found amid the marble floors and designer furniture was a trove of items that seemed shockingly out of place in such a palatial residence. Gannon, referencing evidence logs and photos, begins to list the seized items one by one. The prosecutor clicks through presentation slides and jurors see images of each item laid out on evidence tables, a startling inventory of vice, multiple sex toys of various types and sizes found in drawers and closets, 6 bottles of baby oil, some half-used, stashed alongside expensive colognes, 8 bottles of Astroglide lubricant, the clear gel in each bottle catching the light of the camera flash, condoms, dozens of them, some in boxes, others loose, of assorted brands, women's lingerie and 7-inch platform high heels, including a pair of towering black stiletto heels sequined and scuffed on the soles, firearm components, upper and lower receivers of AR-15 rifles, essentially the building blocks of semi-automatic weapons with serial numbers defaced. As Agent Gannon reads out this catalog, one can sense the jurors' eyes widening. It's the juxtaposition that's most jarring. The trappings of kinky sex alongside the pieces of military-style rifles. It's as if the excesses of pleasure and paranoia were all stored together in one place, Combs's inner sanctum. Photos from Combs's master bedroom closet displayed to the jury show tidy shelves holding these disparate items side by side, high heels and sex toys next to ammunition magazines and rifle parts. The narrative that prosecutors have been building all week suddenly has concrete visuals. This was not just hearsay from traumatized witnesses. Here is physical evidence suggesting a life that mixed violence, control, and indulgence. Agent Gannon zeroes in on the firearms parts. He testifies that the serial numbers had been filed off the AR-15 receivers, a federal crime in itself. Defacement of serial numbers is typically done to prevent law enforcement from tracing the weapon, Gannon explains, his tone matter of fact. The implication? Combs or someone in his employ intentionally tried to hide the origins of these gun parts, raising the question of why he needed untraceable weaponry. Were these components part of a larger arsenal? Were they meant for an offense or just a sense of security? Those questions hang unspoken, but the jurors can certainly ponder the possibilities. When Gannon holds up the evidence for the jury, the scene reaches a strangely theatrical climax. In his gloved hands, he lifts a pair of those 7-inch platform heels, shiny black, the kind of performer like Hayes might wear, or that might have adorned Cassie during a freak-off. The heels look almost absurd in the hands of a stern federal agent. Some jurors tilt their heads as if trying to picture the context. A man who was once one of the richest and most powerful figures in music, now on trial, and here an agent displays his confiscated kinky footwear to 12 citizens deciding his fate. It's a moment that encapsulates the trial's dichotomy, the high life and the secret life laid bare together. The prosecution moves on to the final evidentiary points for the day. Gannon confirms they also seized loaded gun magazines, one with 19 rounds, another with 10, ready ammunition for weapons that may or may not have been present. There were also surveillance gadgets and security infrastructure that suggested Combs was obsessed with monitoring his domain. Earlier in the trial, testimony hinted he kept close tabs on those around him. Now, the physical security setup of his mansion underscores that paranoia and need for control. Gannon's testimony methodically links many of the seized items to what prior witnesses have described: baby oil and lingerie to the freak-off sessions, firearms to Combs's willingness to use violence, and so on. As the clock nears late afternoon, the prosecutor glances at the time and decides to conclude Agent Gannon's direct examination for the day. The government will continue questioning him Wednesday morning, delving further into the trove of evidence. For now, they've given the jury plenty to absorb. The judge announces that court will adjourn for the day. The jurors begin gathering their notebooks, still casting curious looks at the eclectic array of exhibits now sealed in plastic bags on the evidence table. Day 7 ends with these artifacts of depravity literally on display, leaving an indelible image in everyone's mind. Combs stands to leave, flanked by his attorneys, and for a moment his gaze lifts toward the evidence table. If the defendant is feeling any shock or embarrassment at the exposure of his private possessions, he doesn't show it. His face remains a mask of cool indifference, the same practice poker face he's worn much of the trial. But one of his lawyers, whispering in his ear, looks more perturbed, perhaps already strategizing how to downplay this evidence as mere lifestyle choices rather than instruments of crime. The tension in Combs's legal team is subtle yet noticeable. They understand how damning this scene could be to a jury. Strategy under scrutiny. As observers file out of the courtroom, conversations spark up in hushed tones about the day's impact on the overall case. Legal analysts following the trial note that the prosecution's strategy is becoming clear, overwhelm the jury with a pattern of behavior so egregious and so systematic that they can't help but see it as an organized criminal enterprise. Over 7 days, prosecutors have presented a mosaic of Combs's life, former employees, victims, family members, and agents, all contributing pieces of the puzzle. By now, the jurors have heard about decades of alleged abuse, threats, and illicit behavior, from Combs allegedly forcing women like Cassie into coerced sex shows, to wielding firearms in public vendettas, to stockpiling drugs and untraceable gun parts, to bribery and blackmail attempts. It's a narrative that spans from private bedrooms to international flights, from recording studios to secret hotel suites. Yet, as some commentators point out, knitting these sensational stories into a cohesive legal case is the prosecution's greatest challenge. The charges at hand, sex trafficking by force, racketeering conspiracy, transportation for prostitution, and even firearms violations, require proof of intent and coordination. They must prove not just that Combs did terrible things, but that he did them as part of a deliberate system, an ongoing enterprise of crime. One former federal prosecutor analyzing the trial on cable news noted that so far, the government has yet to definitively make the case that all these incidents tie together into a single criminal scheme. In other words, while the sheer volume of shocking testimony is damaging to Combs' reputation, the jury's task is to determine legal guilt on specific counts. And that means the prosecution must connect the dots in a way that shows Combs planned and orchestrated these acts with criminal intent, not merely that he was a rich, reckless man with a sordid private life. Today's testimony both helped and highlighted the struggle in that regard. David James's story suggested an entourage working in concert, security, assistants, and employees all knowingly aiding Combs' abusive proclivities, whether out of fear or loyalty. His anecdote about being reimbursed from a duffel bag and the quip that security guards joked, "Do you know what rhymes with tired, fired?" strongly support the idea that Combs ruled through fear and had a network at his beck and call. If the jury believes James, that's a building block for the racketeering charge. It paints Combs' organization as not just a music empire, but a criminal one, with underlings enabling his crimes. Sharay Hayes' testimony too pointed to coordination. Employees gave Combs cash to pay the male escort, and these sessions were arranged through intermediaries. Prosecutors can argue this shows Combs didn't act alone. He relied on staff to set up and clean up his freak-offs, effectively trafficking Cassie by recruiting others like Hayes to participate and paying them. However, Hayes also handed the defense a narrative lifeline by testifying that it seemed consensual. Legal experts watching noted the defense is likely to hammer that point. If even the escort thought Cassie wasn't being forced, maybe these were consensual kink scenarios, not sex trafficking. The distinction is critical. Under federal law, sex trafficking requires proof of force, fraud, or coercion. Cassie's own words that she only kept doing the freak-offs because Combs blackmailed her with sex tapes is central to proving coercion. The prosecution will surely remind the jury of that. What looked consensual to an outsider was in fact under duress from Cassie's perspective. Regina Ventura's testimony, brief as it was, packed a punch for establishing Combs' intent to control and coerce. A legal commentator on one social media live feed remarked that a mother taking out a loan to pay off her daughter's abuser is a prosecutor's dream evidence of coercion. It demonstrates how Combs exerted pressure and instilled fear beyond just Cassie, extending to her family. The threat to release sex tapes and to harm Cassie if disobeyed goes straight to proving that any consent Cassie gave was vitiated by fear. Classic coercion. The defense notably did not attempt to rebut Regina's account, likely to avoid appearing callous. But in closing, they might argue that Combs returning the money shows he didn't ultimately extort her, a slender thread to grasp, but perhaps they'll use it to cast doubt or portray it as a misunderstanding rather than a serious shakedown. The introduction of the physical evidence from the raid also advanced the prosecution's cause, yet not without potential pitfalls. On one hand, those defaced gun parts and the sheer arsenal of sex paraphernalia bolster the image of Combs living a double life steeped in illegality. It's hard for the defense to explain away an AR-15 receiver with no serial number as anything but nefarious. That could support an additional firearms charge and generally make the jury view Combs as someone with criminal tendencies. On the other hand, The defense had preemptively complained that the raid was excessive and unnecessary, and Gannon acknowledged in his testimony that it was an unusually large-scale operation. Defense attorneys have hinted they'll argue the government is overreaching, treating a celebrity like a cartel boss to stage a spectacle. In a moody trial full of shocking claims, they might suggest the raid images were meant to prejudice the jury, not illuminate the crimes. As day 7 ends, the legal chess match is in a delicate phase. The prosecution has laid out most of its primary case, and while they have certainly portrayed Combs as a deeply abusive figure, legal analysts debate whether they have firmly established the enterprise element of the RICO charge. The racketeering count requires showing Combs led an organized pattern of criminal activity. Some experts think the prosecution is relying heavily on the jury's moral outrage to fill in the blanks. The defense, for its part, seems to be pursuing a twofold strategy: acknowledge Combs' flaws but deny his crimes. Indeed, Combs' team has conceded some unflattering things. They haven't really disputed that he had a heavy drug habit, that he could be a bullying boss and a bad boyfriend. They're using that partial admission to build credibility, only to pivot and insist that none of it rises to the level of what the government alleges. Yes, they'll say Combs lived a wild life, but a consensual one. Yes, he was at times cruel or erratic, but not a criminal mastermind. It's a risky strategy given how abhorrent some admitted behavior is, like physical abuse of Cassie, which the defense hasn't outright conceded but hasn't effectively refuted either. But they're banking on the idea that jurors might hesitate to send someone to prison for life for being a bad person if they aren't convinced the letter of the law was violated. One observer described the trial's progression as a slow boiling cauldron. Each day turns up the heat with new revelations, and you can see both sides testing when it might reach a boiling point. Day 7 certainly cranked the fire higher. The mood in the courtroom at day's end is a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Everyone knows bigger moments are still to come, yet each day's testimony leaves a residue of tension that's hard to shake off.